Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Reframe series. If you've liked the series so far, please hit the like button, leave a comment, and subscribe so we can continue growing our channel. And today we have a very special guest with us. So we have Nikhil Gargeya with us. And Nikhil is a senior strategic partnerships manager at Activate, a nonprofit organization that empowers scientists to reinvent the world by bringing their research to market to address climate change and other global challenges. His work between government and the private sector, transforming scientists into high impact entrepreneurs through a fellowship that guides them along every step of the journey. So before this, Nikhil worked with Next 47, the Siemens venturing arm, and he holds a Bachelor of Science in Environmental Science from UC Berkeley. He has been on the board of the YPE San Francisco Bay Area, and he is also a Clean Energy Leadership Institute Fellow. So it's really nice to have you here joining us today. Thank you for being on this podcast. And I'd love to start us off with the question of what inspired you to get involved in climate change related work?
Thanks so much, Arpita. First off, I appreciate the really generous and gracious introduction. I would say I think people come to work from various paths. For some people, it's like they go to college and they go study a discipline, and that sort of leads them into some work. For me, I think it started with a class in high school. So I grew up in the Bay Area, and I was in high school, and I took an environmental sciences class, really on a whim. I didn't know what to expect. I think I broadly thought I was climate oriented, whatever that meant at that time. And so I took the class, and I was just taken by, I think, this question of how do we study the environment around us, better understand it, better understand the human footprint on the world and how we interact with the world. And that kind of got me thinking a lot more about those topics. And so when I went to college, that was what I applied for in a lot of places. But I still really wasn't sure that that was what I was going to study. It was kind of, I don't know what else I'm going to do. So let's go in and look at that. When I was in college, I actually branched out a little bit. College was great. I had a chance to explore a lot of different areas. So as I said, I came in with environmental sciences, continued to take a lot of classes. It was a very broad science degree for people who aren't familiar with the discipline. At the same time, I was taking like chemical engineering, math, some civil engineering, like some policy as part of my studies. So I was exposed to a lot of different stuff. But I think I got to a point where I realized that I was really interested in understanding the impact that we were having on the climate, understanding some of the challenges. The degree provided a lot of frameworks to think about how do you measure toxicity, impact of what our activities on the environment, overall, air pollution, climate change, managing and understanding animals and sort of populations in the environment. It was sort of a mishmash of a whole bunch of things. And I got to a point where I think I got very tired of like studying the environment itself and studying impacts. And I became more interested in, okay, well, what are we going to actually do about this? Like, we can only sort of look at this data for so many hours, so many days, so many years. What is actually going on? And in some of my classes, I was taken back to a lot of the large policy conferences that had happened globally, whether it was around wildlife endangerment and certain species management, other like climate accords that had taken place a couple of decades prior and were actually going on while I was in college as well. And I became very interested in like that sort of activity in terms of what are we doing to address things. Within all of that, energy became a subset or an industry focus that really drew my attention. Solar had already been taken off for a couple of decades. And I joined the Berkeley Energy and Resources Collaborative, which was a club on campus. Incidentally, I think the largest student-run energy club in the US, which is kind of cool. And I got exposed to so many different areas within that. And I realized this is what I'd like to spend my time on. Like there was something about the combination of the technologies, as well as the impact that really sort of grabbed me. I remember, I think must have been very subliminal at the time, but we used to visit India a lot, like a lot of diasporic communities and folks who at least have the resources to go back and visit family and all of that. And I was always struck by sort of what characterized the difference of experience. One is different climate and different environment, culture, and all of that. But the other thing was like energy as a theme was something that we sort of defined high productivity and quality of life in the West. And it was something that when we visited India, there were outages or like there was a grid which was not able to keep up with demand. And it came back to me that that was something that on a very human level also touched our experience. And I think that sort of kept me interested in it on a different level than sort of the intellectual exercise of greening the grid and all of that stuff that I was looking at. I should mention also as part of Berk, I actually earlier on in my college career, I joined a couple of clubs, including like Project Rishi, just focused on sort of development practice and rolling out of sort of more democratized like medical solutions. But with that filter on a lot of what I was looking at, which was sort of rolling out energy solutions perhaps to rural populations, I became very interested in seeing how we could use the knowledge that we had in the West or just in developed economies and also provide services and extend that to places in the world that we could almost leapfrog the development that we had already gone through to help people decarbonize their economies in a more equitable way along the way. So all of this was sort of happening at once. And when I left college, I think I had this degree. It was a broad science degree. I had some classes in like startup practice. I had some in energy and renewables. And I didn't really know what I was going to do next, in all honesty. And how I ended up in my first job actually was as part of Berk, I was organizing a bunch of events. One of the themes that we were really focused on is as undergraduates in an area as broad as energy or climate, we're kind of pigeonholed into our own disciplines. And as broad as your discipline is, you don't always get exposed to like, what can you go do? And particularly if you're not in engineering or you're not in policy, where there is kind of a path, like you're given some skills and you can find roles that sort of say, hey, I'm looking for someone with this engineering background or whatnot. With a degree like mine, it wasn't really clear what that looked like. And so we put on a networking event every year for students, and we invited sort of the gamut of people from various professions across this space. So like people working in forestry with the state or with the federal government, people working with the California Public Utilities Commission on policy and planning, people working at startups on like new energy storage and generation technologies. And in that process, I actually reached out to someone who later on would become my boss, my first boss. So this gentleman, very interesting background, undergrad at Cal, PhD in mechanical engineering at Stanford, worked in sort of aeronautics for a bit, but transitioned to the venture community and was looking at new energy solutions and trying to fund them early on back when Clean Tech 1.0 was happening, the first wave of investments. He just looked like a very interesting person. And so I reached out. They happened to be in Berkeley, and that gentleman was working at Siemens at the time in like a venture role. And I said, hey, you have a very interesting background. Go Bears. You also went to Cal. Is there any interest in joining us for that evening? You'll basically just be chatting with students like myself who are trying to get into this space. And he said, sorry, this is late notice, so I can't join you. And so we left it there, but he reached out and asked a little bit more about my background, what I was interested in doing. We sort of left it there. A couple months later, he actually reached out as I was beginning my job search. He reached out and said, hey, do you want a job? I actually have a job you might be interested in as a junior person on this venturing team for Siemens. And it worked out really well. I was very lucky in that regard. It sort of hit some of my excitement around new ideas entering the market. I would get to see a lot of what Siemens, a large, manufacturing and equipment producer for the energy world, what they were doing, what the history had been, what the challenges were in terms of like Siemens having installed so much of what we see as the grid today. Like, what is next in terms of bringing on the capacity of renewables and other things, and what is a player like this looking at and doing with startups to do that? That's kind of how I've gotten into my work. That was long, so.
I think it's really nice to actually hear, because I think a lot of students or folks who are in the professional world who might be interested in trying to enter the climate change field may not necessarily know about like how do you actually get connected, and it seems like a lot of that really relates to networking and providing opportunities to connect with those who are already present. At least that's what I'm taking away from your experience.
It absolutely does. And like I said, part of the reason that that club was so valuable was in part because we were trying to organize such events. And for me, it allowed me, so the structure of the club, if folks are unfamiliar with the club, it had like a graduate level. So it had folks from various technical departments at the graduate, material sciences, mechanical engineering, as well as business, as well as law. So it was a unique club in itself, and it provided a lot of that connectivity, like people from very different disciplines coming together to actually say, like, here are some of the policy challenges. How do we supplement that with like the technology that's coming down the pipeline? But it also provided an undergrad like me some FaceTime with people I would never otherwise meet, and I think that was amazing.
Yeah, I think that's really wonderful, and just the fact that you took on a leadership role within such an organization, and how it cultivated those relationships, so you were able to access an opportunity down the line that you may not have had access to before.
Very
It's
much,
really cool.
very much. Um,
Yeah. So I'm curious to know, what were some of the challenges that you ran into on your journey in first getting involved with the venture capital work, or in that space, and then currently in the position that you're in now and the kind of work that you get to do, which I'd love for you to share more about.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think as people may have gotten a sense of, as I was in college, um, given my discipline, uh, being environmental science is a pretty broad degree. I think compared to a lot of my classmates, the path wasn't totally clear, and I was sort of figuring that out along the way. And if I looked at a lot of the skill set that I had, which is sort of like general science training, the scientific method, putting out a theory and a hypothesis and testing it, all of that was well and good, but I didn't sort of come out with too many very specific skill sets. One thing that I had done during school, Burke was one, which sort of honed some of the networking side of things. That I am an introvert. I'm not very much of a people person, but sort of being comfortable with saying, "Hey, I don't know this. You seem to be good at this. Could I take a few minutes of your time?" The other side was Beacon, which was a club which was focused on sort of a student group focused on consulting, but specifically for organizations that are either looking to green their footprint or reduce their environmental impact in some way, and just providing students a structure with a project, engaging with folks in private industry and saying what type of problems are they looking to solve, being creative about like trying to address some of those challenges, doing a little bit of research, putting it all together in a presentation and sharing that with a client at the end of it. That was, tremendously helpful. And I think a lot of that ended up being helpful in being able to talk about some of that work and what I was interested in concretely when I joined Siemens and when I was interviewing for that role. Is that I think that's what I was, yeah. Um, any other part of the question that I didn't address?
So I think more like once you began working, what were you noticing kind of any just I think internally were you noticing things, patterns or kind of your own how you were able to resonate with the work or kind of the challenge of different stakeholders when you began doing the work, um, and kind of um, now that you've kind of transitioned into a different role, are you seeing different challenges or are you seeing similar challenges?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think taking off from from my last point, one of the challenges was in coming out with a degree that gave me a broad skill set. It was a double-edged sword. The positive side was I felt like I could learn a lot of new things, in part because my degree was a mixture of various disciplines, and because of that, like a lot of the classes I'd mentioned were in different departments, and so I felt comfortable being in different rooms studying different things. So at times it was hard, but that sort of helped. Other side is that you don't come out with too many very specific skill sets. So if someone says so what skill set are you bringing to this team? I could count on a couple of my experiences from college, but otherwise a lot of it was on the job learning, which I actually thought was very exciting. And so a lot of my job at Siemens, for example, was like landscaping efforts around new technology areas. So I was looking at what was then called Internet of Things, has sort of morphed into other terminology now. But what does that look like? How do you develop a methodology to help systematize an understanding of what that stack of technologies looks like? Then find startup partners who might be able to plug in and help Siemens implement some of those solutions. The same thing was true of AI. I did not have a software background, but spending some time learning what the software stack looked like, where were teams working on unique value adds, and being able to chat with them to the extent that you could differentiate them from somebody else in the market, and knowing that, hey, this is a valuable team, and working with our venture directors to work that out. Now, that was the exciting part. Some of the challenge, I think, was in that team. I was one of the very few junior people, so I had like an undergraduate degree, was fairly new. Most of the other folks, including my boss, were all PhDs and had been working for a few years. I think the youngest person was probably in their mid 30s. Um, so it was great to work with such people. You got to absorb a lot of their experience. At the same time, you sort of look at them and it's sometimes it always feels like playing catch up a little bit. And so there is a little bit of that imposter syndrome that settles in every so often, that like, am I learning fast enough? Am I not where I'm supposed to be? And that was just a very real part of that also. Um, I will say, sort of with an immigrant background and being from the Bay Area, luckily I grew up with people who sort of looked like me around me. And I think extending that into the work environment, I was lucky that my first boss was also Indian American, had been had been raised here and went to school here. So there was a little bit of that commonality. Um, and the rest of the office too was very interestingly a mishmash of a lot of immigrant folks. So I would say, like, when we looked around, I think the only like sort of white male American sort of born and raised, I think we had one or two. And if we looked at the native born Americans, they were all Indian Americans. So in that sense, we were actually super lucky in terms of a team that was well represented from that perspective. Um, and I think that's, if you look at the sort of the graduate educated community in the US, that's actually pretty true, is that we have stronger representation among immigrants, certain sets of immigrant groups in graduate studies. Yeah.
Yeah, that's so cool. And it's something that I don't typically like expect in kind of climate change or environmental science related work. So that's really cool to hear about your experience, and it makes me so curious to to know what other spaces are like. So thank you for sharing that. So kind of in continuation with that, in your, now you've kind of like transitioned into a new role where you're working with scientists and helping them develop that kind of entrepreneurial lens and approach in your work. Are there, have you encountered kind of any challenges in your own kind of space in that work, and in general, any trends that you've noticed?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was at Siemens for about 3 or 4 years, and at that time, uh, I was basically at a point where I had learned a lot about the startup ecosystem, sort of how companies got funded. Um, but as if you may have noticed, some of the technology areas that I was focusing on, while some of them had applications in energy, a lot of the work I was doing was sort of uh, the technology focus was different. It was sort of software solutions for asset management on the factory floor, and things like that. So I think I got to a point where I thought I wanted to like center back to an area of focus that I really was passionate about. And one thing, like my experience at Siemens was great in many ways. Like I got to understand a lot of what I went into the experience trying to understand, which was what is the state of the world right now from a technology and a solutions perspective, um, for energy infrastructure and infrastructure in general. I think what I was looking a little bit more for, and which spurred me to sort of look for my next role, was Siemens, for example, is a large producer of like gas turbines, um, which is like an energy generator. And for me, like one of the big questions was like, hey, like where is the next generation like zero carbon combustion technology that like Siemens definitely should be like looking into, because we're in this energy transition, and like where are those solutions? Why are we not running projects in those areas? Um, and the reasons, of course, are plenty. There's always like an interest for the sort of the large corporate structure to be behind those initiatives and all of that. But the reality is we just weren't doing as many of those as I would have liked. And so when I had been graduating, like whatever 4 years prior, I'd heard of an organization being not spun out of the university, but sort of adjacent to the university, focused on science innovation, very early stage innovation, looking at breakthrough technologies. So like carbon to value or carbon to products, or like carbon capture technologies, new renewables technologies. And that sort of came back into my mind. We had that group actually come by and had some of their teams present. It really piqued my interest. And at that time, I wasn't sure how I would fit in. And it so happened that they, at that time, were looking for, they'd grown, they'd sort of not graduated, they'd brought on one cohort, were bringing on the second cohort. So the initiatives was well on its way. And they were kind of like, we're looking for someone to expand our corporate interface, work with the teams to help think about, okay, now that you have a prototype, what do you do next? And it just so happened that I was introduced to their team, and that was my next job. I spoke with them and became really passionate about maybe there is that combustion technology somewhere in their portfolio. And sure enough, a couple of years later, there was a zero carbon combustion technology that I got a chance to work with and was super jazzed about. So that, I think that interest to come back to fundamental improvement in technology solutions to try and address climate at a large level, and knowing that we basically had to open up the funnel a little bit. Like the number of ideas that were being tested out throughout the ecosystem in different ways, I knew that the aperture had to be like opened a little bit. And this program at that time called M37, soon to be Cyclotron Road, and now Activate, was where a lot of that was happening. And that's how I landed in my current role, where I am sort of on the other side of that table, where I'm in part a mentor for teams thinking about you're bringing a new solution to market, very technology heavy, often in the lab, just on the verge of commercialization. How do you think about strategy to commercialize? Who are you supposed to be working with? If you are often working with an established entity, because these are, as you may guess from like the technologies I'm mentioning, these are like B2B type markets. You're very deep in the supply chain somewhere. How do you develop those relationships and make it valuable? I had some of that lens coming out of Siemens, and so the goal was to extend some of that. Yeah, and I can touch on some of my other work if it is helpful, but I'll pause there for a second.
Yeah, so I think it's great to hear you talk about this, and also the transition between kind of working at Siemens and then working at Activate, and how the skills and the networks and the experiences that you had were able to help kind of shape your experience here and really inform the work that you do now. So I think oftentimes people find it challenging to figure out how do you actually utilize what you've already done in your past work, and then you utilize it in this new space. So really nice to hear you kind of touch on that. Yeah, are there other things that you would like to mention related to this?
Absolutely. So I'll take your last point a little bit and just say that for me, it certainly was a leap of faith too to join. I'll call it Cyclotron Road because it was Cyclotron Road at that time. It became Activate. It itself was a startup, right? It was a nonprofit organization. It was looking to launch this fellowship. Had done it, as I said, for a couple of years, but the viability of it, the hypothesis that like science and science solutions and scientists, the people who are actually behind these solutions who are looking to commercialize them, are vitally important to the future of the planet and have historically really changed how we bring solutions to market and changed what quality of life looks like for humans, and that it's going to be a large part of the energy transition and the climate mitigation strategy that we have going forward. But a lot of that was sort of untested at that time. And so what I would highly encourage people, especially young people who, are in a corporate job, maybe feeling a little bit safe, maybe doing work that is very interesting, but you're sort of looking over the fence at something that is either nascent or you're not 100% sure about, but you're very passionate about what is going on in that area, to certainly do your due diligence, speak to them, get a sense of where they're going, how they're thinking about it, which for me sold it, by the way. Chatting with the team, I knew for a fact this was going to go somewhere, and if it was going to fail, it was going to fail in an amazingly, fantastic way, and I wanted to be there. But take that chance, because you never know what, where these things are going to lead, and it's absolutely necessary that we're at a moment to take those leaps, and particularly if you feel like you're coming from a background where you've had the benefit of education, of maybe a family background, a socioeconomic background, where you feel like, I have parents behind me, I have a community behind me. It's all right. I have some savings in the bank. It's all right if I take this. I think it's great to then take that and run with it. I've always felt that while this is not true of everybody, if you have some of those benefits, it almost behooves me to go take some of those risks on behalf of people who really can't, right? And there are many, many of those people. And whatever that risk is for you, you should make that call for yourself. But it really gives you a sense of purpose, I think.
Yeah, that's cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I guess coming into this, we kind of answered one of the questions that I was hoping that you would touch on, which is how did you land your current role, and what helps guide your work in this position? I'd love to know now, what does a day-to-day look like for you in your current position?
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of how I transitioned, I touched on that. It was exciting for me. I was looking for something new also. And so when I started, What guided a lot of my thinking at that time was trying to get out of sort of a more um, not necessarily rigid, because I think even my team at Siemens was fairly creative in their own way, right? Working within the corporate structure. But how do you sort of put on a perhaps even more scrappy mindset in terms of, hey, we are getting this thing off the ground. We have to manage among like a 5-person team to basically do whatever it takes to help these entrepreneurs get to that next stage. And that was tremendously exciting. One mindset that I had, and it was sometimes very challenging, is that, as I said, it felt very much like a startup in itself. And there are times you get pushed to your limits. You are doing everything and all that you can. And sometimes finding moments to center and saying, it's all right if not everything goes the way you expect. I, again, in that scenario, was sort of the first, I was a junior person to join, right? Everybody was a good 10, 15 years older than me, which I considered, again, a great opportunity to work with an awesome team. But it comes with its own challenges, and some of that thinking does permeate. And so my goal sort of within the first 2 years really switched to, I'm here, I'm doing good work, I've been brought in for a reason, and let's continue to grow and deliver on what people seem to see as valuable in terms of what I'm providing. Get great feedback, see how you can grow. And that has been like at times challenging, but tremendously like rewarding and really wonderfully fulfilling. And I just remind, like, again, a lot of young people for whom it can be hard to be pushed to your limits. But sometimes that is the moment where you grow the most. I think at the same time, like mental health management and awareness is absolutely valuable, and sort of know yourself. Like when can you sort of clench your fist and go full on and white knuckle it in certain situations, and in other cases know that I've been white knuckling it for like a couple months and really need to pull back and take some time for myself. But some of the most rewarding time that I've experienced has been during that time. If I collect my thoughts and think back, a lot of what we focus on at Activate as a nonprofit, I should say, as a nonprofit in the space that is supporting ideas at the earliest portion of the funnel when ideas are coming in to be commercialized, we have a very like open source approach to things, I would say, which is a large portion of what really drives me. It's about like, how are we creating bridges to like solve gaps in the ecosystem that we see in terms of commercialization? What can we do to help solve those through tools, through learning, through education, for our fellows as well as the ecosystem? And there's a huge emphasis of experimentation that is constantly going through our mind. And as we've grown from about 5 people to nearing 40 now, that has, as you can imagine, shifted to introducing some process so that we don't, lose track of performance and really continue to deliver on our goals. But that has been really central to even like how I've appreciated things. And that's been wonderful. One of the things that's come out of that, which I've had the pleasure of being associated with, was looking at the gap of in commercializing a new technology. Often when a small company will approach an established partner, the conversation often goes something like this. Large company or approaches the small or vice versa. They have what is considered a mutually very interesting conversation, right? One, the small player is bringing in a new technology, probably promises head and shoulders above what we can do today. There are obviously risks involved. Large companies super jazzed about it, particularly if they're like an innovation scout. They're like, yes, we need to be working on this together. And often people would sort of go on these conversations, check in every couple months, but there wasn't really a path forward. And that happened a lot with our teams. What I'd noticed at Siemens, if I put my corporate hat back on, was a lot of companies had a great way of taking something that sort of had a box around it. And what I mean by that is it was a product or a fully delivered service, that a company had already spent a lot of time developing. It sort of had its bounds put together. It had technical specifications, was ready to go put onto the grid or try out in a scenario. People knew what to do with that. But with a lot of the technologies that we were working with, they were still in the lab. And the question is like, how do you get that tested? What does a large corporate even do with that? And so we actually got a grant from the Department of Energy and worked with a lot of members of the ecosystem to say, how do you bridge that gap? What does that first project look like? How do you reduce the barriers to get to that first project, which can often mean the difference between a company petering out or getting an infusion of like $100,000, $50,000 of non-dilutive capital funded, development work, where the corporate is like, hey, if you can reach like these 5 milestones, that's amazing. That's significant for us. And that gives a whole lot of benefit and signals to the market. It shows that this technology is relevant for the entrepreneur and they know they're on the right track. Someone's willing to pay for this. And so what we ended up doing is looking at the project scope of what was going on in the ecosystem, trying to boil that down as simple as possible, working with some really awesome partners at DLA Piper, which is a global law firm, and coming up with the simple partnership agreement, which was a set of contracts and a framework to think about launching these first projects. And we sort of formed it around 2 formats of contracts that were meant to go through corporate approvals, right? We look at what's the easiest way to get something through procurement. What do you need? Who is signing off on this? And, since that has been launched like 3-4 years ago now, there have been like hundreds of teams that have used that in some manner to reduce a lot of the legal cost burden in terms of running through, going back and forth, spending thousands of dollars on legal fees, on time to negotiate some of these contracts that would often take 6 to 18 months, reducing that to anywhere from 3 to 5 months, getting a cash infusion in the bank, and just speeding a lot of these processes in commercialization. That wouldn't have been possible without folks on my team who really emphasized the benefit of experimentation, a lot of the culture of the company and the culture of being in a nonprofit, right? Developing something for the ecosystem sort of at no cost because it's going to make the world better and it's going to improve the lives of our teams as they're commercializing things. It's those types of things that have really kept me very excited to be in the work that I'm doing. And going back to some of the points we hit on earlier regarding like my entering the field initially not knowing what my value add was, it's things like this, working with stakeholders across very disparate groups, across government, private industry, startups, investors, to take them along on this ride and say, hey, there's something we all can do better. Let, in this case, Activate sort of, and my group be that convening force and then driving that conversation forward. And as we grow, as Activate now, our mission goes from the one site that I had joined now 5 years ago to 4 sites now, 8 sites in the next 3-4 years to really supercharge science innovation and commercialization. It's those types of conversations that I'm helping trying to create with Activate, is how do you continue building bridges to reduce some of the gaps in funding, in partnership difficulties around science commercialization. And now we're at the size where we can actually convene those groups, which is super exciting. So believe in what you're doing, get super into the nitty gritty, and enjoy what you're doing, and know that at the end of it, so long as you're creating some value for a group, that is perhaps what feels like a small piece, but it's like absolutely necessary that you do it. It's very similar to a paraphrasing of what Gandhiji has said, or is attributed to having said, that what you feel like you're doing may feel very insignificant, but it's most important that you do it. And that's true for many of the things that we're all trying to tackle, especially at this stage with things like climate change, with sort of global nationalism emerging and being a pretty staying force right now. racism and things like that. It's the little everyday actions and showing up in every way that you can.
Yeah. So as I'm hearing you talk, I think some themes that I'm noticing is, I think throughout your undergrad experience, it was a very interdisciplinary kind of skill set and education that you had. And I think the work that I see you kind of having done over time is also very interdisciplinary and at the intersection of a lot of different organizations and groups and fields. So I know you were saying one of the challenges that you had when you initially started at Siemens was kind of not having a specific field of knowledge, but it seems like this interdisciplinary nature and your ability to work within those different between those different groups has actually like really helped you over time. Is That's what I'm picking up from this conversation. Um, another aspect of it is I'm so intrigued to learn, and it does go into this question of your day to day experience because you've kind of Activate has gone from a 5-person team to now what it sounds like is a 40-person team, and in that process you've been there from that initial stage. How has your day-to-day changed over time, and what have certain periods been more hours than others? Do you feel like it's more stabilized now? So I'd just love to hear more about that.
Yeah, that's a great question. Certainly, there is some change. I think some of the themes I'd mentioned around experimentation and sort of building tools for the ecosystem that has remained constant. And I think as any like startup, if you think of this as a startup, as I keep mentioning, if you think of a startup, the culture at the end of the day is going to save you. Like if you want to keep certain elements of that as you grow, it's going to save you. So that's something we've kept. My role specifically, I've always been involved in sort of network building and connectivity with external resources for our fellows and being a champion for them as much as possible. That's been a constant. The change has been, I think, how broad that is, right? With 5 people, literally a lead comes through the door. It's kind of like, well, whoever has some spare time is going to take that. I remember the first time um, feeling that difference coming from Siemens, where I was given a lot of responsibility as a young person. At the same time, with the corporate structure, people definitely followed a lot of sort of the rank and chain of command, which is more common in a corporate. So when executives came from Germany and whatnot, I would contribute to some presentations that I wouldn't necessarily be presenting them. I'd have like a slide up that I'd help contribute to. And here I was, where like, you know, my boss and I set up a meeting with like the CTO of a large energy company who's in town. And 5 minutes before the meeting, he's like, you know what? I really have to take this call. Can you take the meeting by yourself? And to give you a sense, my boss was basically like an experienced business development, sales, and commercialization VP. And I was like, I guess I'm doing this. And so it's sort of morphed from that, which in itself was amazing and very growing for me, a really formative experience for me, to having more processes, helping set some of those in terms of taking what we knew was valuable in building relationships, where Activate should be focusing, where we should not be focusing. And anybody in a startup will resonate with that. You realize there's some things you really should have other folks in the ecosystem focus on. At the same time, I think the passion is still there. And I think our eyes have been open to going from speaking about a large vision to realizing it. And really going after, like, as I said, the big numbers, going towards 200 fellows a year in terms of support at steady state, garnering lots of funding from various large philanthropic and government and corporate groups. And sort of realizing that has been a lot of that change. And we've grown to increase the capacity of the organization to help us and bring on people who are very like-minded and really helping us do a lot of the work on the ground to help us achieve that. My day-to-day, so as of today, my day to day is split between two things. Um,
Mm.
One, it continues to be connecting with fellows, understanding what their needs are, being a thought partner with them, along with other folks on the team to think about strategy, to think about who they should be connecting with, um, funders, corporates, other folks, entrepreneurs who are in the ecosystem who may be able to help them over this particular challenge that they're going through in terms of understanding the market or what have you. Um, and connecting them with folks. So like a very hands-on day-to-day sort of thing. Um, the second piece is a much longer thing, longer term thought process. It's about now that Activate has grown, we've sort of built a brand, we have a presence in the ecosystem. There are other programs that are adjacent to us that we're so excited to have along the ride with us that never did not exist 5 years ago. And so there's this amazing growth of this ecosystem. Um, in those conversations, making sure that Activate is part of the right conversations, that we are asking the right questions in terms of where we are shaping our strategy. Some of that, for some members on our team, has been we are a human, in part, a human capital development organization, right? We're a fellowship. And so we are really invested in people. And as we're bringing people through this, what does our pipeline look like in upper science education? And what else can we be doing to diversify that, to bring more perspectives to the table? And initially that was, looking at our application pipeline and process. Now it's going back into academia and saying, can we start seeding learning that is going to make entrepreneurship more accessible to more people from different backgrounds who may have never seen themselves uh, in that avatar or in that sort of skill set, and empower them to say, that could be me. Like I could be going into a PhD right now, or I could be leaving an undergrad. Hey, that Activate Fellowship down the line, I think I want to do that, as opposed to catching them later on. So having conversations like that. The second piece is then with Activate's role, not only what conversations are we joining, like the question of sort of diversity in the scientific community, in the applied sciences and science startup community, but what other conversations should we actually be convening as a force in the ecosystem? So as I said, where the Simple Partnership Agreement, or SIPA, came to fruition was like pulling together R&D groups, corporate groups, innovation groups, and early stage startups to have these valuable conversations. What are the other conversations that we should be having? Like, is it around, like, where is hydrogen going in the ecosystem? Like, where are the new technologies that are going to move that forward? Or around energy storage? What is coming down the pipeline in the basic sciences world that really should be moving into applied sciences and commercialization? And how are we taking inputs from the market and then bringing that forward through this pipeline that we've created now? And so those are like broader level thinking. And the question is, what are those stakeholders? Who all need to be at that table? How do we think about making that as inclusive and valuable a discussion so that we are actually creating the decarbonized, inclusive, like, future that we'd like to create, using the opportunity of the energy transition as a moment to have those conversations.
Yeah, wow, that sounds really amazing and so thought-provoking because I think doing that strategic thinking is really what informs like that long-term work that happens over 5 or 10 years. Um, so it's really cool that you're getting the opportunity and the space to do that and really think about kind of those strategic moves that you could be making. And it's also similar to kind of the work of just developing tools that made the process easier for interaction between those startups and corporations to get that initial project off the ground, where if you can streamline the process or create linkages that weren't there before, you might actually be able to really change the way that the system works. Very
Absolutely.
exciting.
Yeah. And it's great to see it also, and like often like when this is all going on, you're just sort of in the weeds. And so it's an option, it's an opportunity to also step back and just like appreciate what has happened, who all have been there along the way to help create some of these things. But it's nice looking back at it and being like, oh yeah, that's kind of cool that all of that came together the way that it did.
Yeah, it's the journey, but you often don't recognize all of the amazing things that have happened on the journey until you look back on it.
Very much, very much. It's through conversations like this. So another reason that I really appreciate your creating this space. Yeah.
Yeah. So kind of the final question that I had for you was, if I think your work is really inspiring, and I think that others maybe who are watching this might be really inspired and want to go into this type of work. I'd love to know, is there any advice or guidance that you would have for them as they're either students who are trying to transition into more of the climate change work, or they're older folks who are trying to transition in but don't necessarily know what pathways that they can pursue?
Yeah, that's a really important question, I think, in all of this. Uh, One, I would say, especially to young people, I mean, if you've made it this far in the in the episode, you'll see that I was sort of finding my way, and that's perfectly fine. You will find sort of what you're most interested in, and really follow that, and just make sure that you feel like you're creating some value in the conversations and the work that you're doing. Um, at the end of the day, it's really rolling up your sleeves and doing the work that you're passionate about. And I will take a moment, I think, to mention that when I was studying environmental sciences, I will say I had tremendously supportive parents who, at the same time, were very cognizant that, like, look, this kid is not studying engineering. He's not studying something that feels like it has a near term sort of employment opportunity. And I think there are a lot of folks in uh, the South Asian community, the South Asian immigrant community, certainly broader the immigrant community at large. And I think that's a very, very valid concern. And there's a reason why they have to bring those concerns, is that they've gone through a lot of the challenges to help establish and provide us a lot of the benefits that we have to go do that. At the same time, I would say that if you truly want to do that work, you should believe in yourself enough to take that risk uh, and really throw yourself into that work without worrying too much about, like, you know, how are people looking at what I'm doing, um, and sort of how do I fit into the broader ecosystem, and start comparing yourself with other people. I will say that I was studying environmental sciences at a time when it was not super common. I think there had been a couple of people, especially from the South Asian community, who had, but in my class of anywhere from 30 to 40 people, there were very few sort of brown people in general, South Asian people even less. And that sometimes gets to you. But um, the other thing is, like, going to parties and, uncle and aunties, as they do, asking sort of what you're up to. And sometimes, with very positive intentions, because of their framing in terms of employment opportunities and what they see as sort of the end goal for schooling and whatnot, not often having a lot to say to me when I share that I'm studying environmental sciences, but that being perfectly fine. And like taking that moment to just, whoever will listen, sharing what you're working on and why you're so passionate about it. Um, and I think that's really important. Um, I would say for young people and for people who are maybe later stage, I think we're actually at a moment, if you're particularly interested in climate, that we have a real wealth of different connector organizations that I think will be super helpful in helping you get started wherever you are along the journey, in terms of learning about, like, what is all of this? Like, even if you're unsure about where you fit in, where your skill set is, um, and taking some time to jump in, use some extra time on your weekends if that's the time that you're taking, and learn about things that just really get you excited. So maybe it's a specific technology, maybe it's like some carbon policy that you're like, hey, that's super interesting. How are the carbon markets shaping up? Why have they not necessarily come to fruition in some places? What are the political questions? What are the on the ground implementation questions? Getting very deep into that. And if you're in school taking a couple classes, and even if you're further along, like finding resources at local universities, community colleges, and whatnot, delve in, sort of develop some basic knowledge in some of the areas that you're most passionate about. Um, I would say reach out to those connector organizations that exist. So a couple of them that I've come across in my journey, one tremendous initiative, which has sort of blossomed in the past, I would say 5 years, has been My Climate Journey, which really started as one entrepreneur with a software background, successful software entrepreneur who had the same question. He was sort of mid career or so, very successful at what he did, saw climate as an impact area. He was like, we all have to get on board. Like, we have no time. And he just started attending a bunch of events. He came to a summit of ours back when he was just in his fact-finding mode, and he was very honest about that. Be like him. What came of that was amazing. He has since launched a Slack community, My Climate Journey, which a couple of years ago, I think you had to be invited. And please reach out to me. Happy to share my contact information. If you'd like to be added to that community, I can do that. All it requires is that you are passionate about the solving the climate challenge, and that you're not a downer on it, and are willing to contribute and learn and just be a cheerleader for that area in whatever way you can. Join that Slack community. There are companies that have come out of those Slack communities by people coming together. There are funding rounds and new ideas and policy initiatives that have been built just through the connectivity of certain organizations like that. And Jason has actually gone on to launch a venture fund as a result of a lot of the ideas and opportunities he's seen through that. So get really involved in those sorts of things. I'm sure they have like happy hours and virtual meetups and things like that. Get involved, meet people. And the extension of that, I would say, as my next tip is like, become comfortable with like introducing yourself and reaching out to people, whether it's over LinkedIn or in person, and just be honest about where you're at and be like, hey, I'm just looking to learn, or I have some skill set. I'm not sure how it relates to this, but I'm passionate about learning. You'd be surprised how many people want to share what they're working on and may even want to connect you with what they're working on or things that are adjacent to that. And that's really the best way I found to continue learning. If you're sort of mid-career too, check out like fellowship experiences that are meant to put you with like-minded individuals to invest a little bit of time to learn about what's out in the space, and then have you invest in some skills that will take you to that next step. For some people, that's like an MBA or like graduate school of some kind. But for me, it's been groups like YPE, Young Professionals in Energy in the Bay Area. We basically organize networking events that pull people together to have these types of conversations. And they had pulled a lot of that stuff online over the pandemic. So it's super easy to log in wherever you're at. The Clean Energy Leadership Institute Fellowship, so the CELI Fellowship, it takes people who are either passionate about getting into it or have a track record in the clean energy space, and who are trying to level up some of that by feeling like, you're at your job, maybe feeling a little isolated, not sure where you fit in, where you want to transition to in terms of a different job in the ecosystem. They help you get like a baseline knowledge on the space and connect with like-minded people in a classroom sort of setting, which is amazing. And I still reach out to those people, and I'm super close to them. So it's a wonderful experience. So highly recommend things like that. And I have a friend, Heidi Lim, who actually works at one of the teams that came out of our program looking at CO2 to products. So one of the big challenges in front of us. And she made this transition with sort of an environmental engineering, environmental sciences background in college, but jumped into enterprise software, sort of trying to figure out what skill sets she wanted to build, and then made the transition to this role at this startup company and has been doing tremendous work with them. And she wrote a tremendous, well-circulated Medium post that you may have even seen already, which talks about you're in a different part of the economy. Maybe you're a software engineer, maybe you're an engineer or an HR person working in the people industry, or like in a different part of the ecosystem. You don't see a direct connection to climate, but you're super passionate and you want to stake your career on climate and want to contribute in some way. She has some amazing tips on how to transition some of those skills. And they're, job sites that are particularly focused on placing people with a diversity of skill sets into climate oriented companies. You'd be surprised how companies and nonprofits and organizations, firms, funding groups with climate as a goal need your skills. And there are many ways that you can find that. Let's see. And I would say, going back to what I'd mentioned about not being afraid to take a couple risks, like all of what we're doing, like some of the jobs, some of the things that we are seeing now didn't even exist 5 years ago. And so if you're passionate about something, take some time and sure, make it a calculated risk, but take that risk and jump all in and go study that, go take that job, do it regardless of what you think people may say about it or whatnot in the short term, because it's really about what you feel you can contribute to the ecosystem. And with that, I will also keep an open door policy and would love to chat with anybody who's interested in learning, not just about what I do, but like how they may be able to plug into the ecosystem.
Yeah, definitely. And I will definitely be linking all of those below so that you have access to them. Yes. Um, Thank you so much for sharing all of this wealth of knowledge and just the amazing work that you're doing. I'm just listening to you. I feel so inspired. I think it can be sometimes very challenging when you see the news on a regular basis, um, and I have friends who are journalists, so just like hearing about all of the world challenges that are going on right now around climate change and environmental justice. But it's so nice to actually meet someone who is doing the work and trying to really push forward organizations and companies and startups um, that are trying to change the world. And so I'm just incredibly inspired by you, and I hope our viewers and listeners are also as inspired as I am, and are able to take the opportunity to connect with you and get involved in this work. So just
I,
really
I,
appreciate
I,
you.
I appreciate this conversation so much, Arpita, and I likewise admire so much of what you've done to create this conversation platform. Because I think a lot of this conversation happen on a one-on-one basis, and sometimes unless you elevate it and share it with a larger ecosystem, that learning isn't shared. People don't understand sort of how to break in to what they would like to do, and I value that service for the community so much, and I'm just in awe of what you've created here, but also a lot of what you do in your day-to-day work as well. So admiration right back.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And for our listeners and viewers, please like, subscribe, and comment and connect with this awesome individual right here. And we'll see you in the next episode.